So, in part 1 of this video, I showed you how to strip the Weihrauch HW97 down to its main component parts, ready for degreasing, according to steps 1 to 7 in the V-Mach Tuning Kit instructions. We also found out why the air rifle had dropped in power, a broken mainspring. In this video, I intend to continue with instructions and show you how to fit the tuning kit and reassemble the rifle. So, to continue, step 8. Prise off the old piston seal and replace it with the one supplied. Now to do this, I'm using a fairly small flat-headed screwdriver, as I found a broad-headed screwdriver very difficult to get onto the seal, but with a bit of effort it comes off. Now, besides the obvious difference in colour, the green V-Mach piston seal is a slightly different shape to the Weihrauch one, plus the outside edges of the seal are left slightly rough compared to the smooth sides to the Weihrauch one. To fit the new seal, start it into the groove in the piston head on one side, then lean heavily onto it while twisting at the same time, and it should pop into place. In step 9, we are to fit the piston sleeve. Now, the piston sleeve is simply just this thin piece of metal, which slides inside the piston, and as far as I understand, this is to help take up any excess room between the inside diameter of the piston and the external diameter of the mainspring, which should help make them fit more snugly together and hopefully eliminate any shakes or rattles. You'll notice that there's a toothed edge in one end of the piston sleeve. This goes into the piston first. Plus, you also need to make sure that the open edge of the sleeve is on the opposite side of the piston from the cocking slot. Now, in stage 10, we are told to lightly apply grease to the piston slot and very sparingly to the piston body, using the grease supplied. Now, I done this with my bare finger instead of using a pair of gloves or a brush, as I could very easily feel what parts of the metal had a coating of grease on it and what didn't. But we'll fast forward this wee bit. It also states in stage 10 that a barely visible coat of grease should be applied to the outside of the piston seal only, ensuring no grease is on the front of the seal face, as putting any grease in the front of the piston seal face will only make the gun diesel. In step 11, we are to assemble the piston back into the compression chamber, ensuring that no damage occurs when passing through the slotted section of the chamber, in other words that little square hole, which you also need to line up with the cocking slot in the piston below. In step 12, we are to lightly apply grease to the outside of the compression chamber and the inside of the main body and refit to the action. Now, I just put grease onto the outside of the compression chamber. My theory was, as it's been pushed into the action, it should apply grease to the inside of the main body anyhow. Step 13 is to reassemble cocking lever, linkage and anti-bear trap. So when you push the compression chamber back into the action, ensure that the little square hole is in line with the cocking slot in the main body. This is so that the end of the cocking lever can fit into it. Don't forget about the anti-bear trap now. Once you have the cocking lever into place, you need to refit the pivot pin. To do this, I raised the action up onto 2 blocks of timber to raise it off of the table. Then, using a parallel punch, I aligned the holes in the action with the holes in the cocking lever, then refitted the pin and tapped it in with the hammer. Then finished it off flush with the action using the parallel punch. Step 14 is to add 2 pre-compression washers to the inside of the piston. I found the easiest way to do this was to bring the cocking lever back, which brought the piston close enough to the end of the rifle the washers could easily be slid into the piston. Step 15 states that with the compression chamber piston assembly in the full forward position, apply the grease supplied behind the assembled units into the main body of the action. This can be applied quite liberally. In other words, you can put a fair amount of it on it. Stage 16 says to lightly coat the outside of the mainspring with the 2 guides fitted and reassemble the rifle completely. Now the mainspring and the 2 guides come already lubricated, so I just put a fairly light coating on it with the grease that's supplied. With this done, simply slide the mainspring into the rifle, with the smaller of the 2 guides going first. Now we need to fit the end block again. To fit the end block, it's simply just the reverse way that we took it off, placing the rifle muzzle down onto the ground, using a piece of cloth or a piece of wood to cushion it, then pushing down onto the spring with the end block and gently screwing it into place. Take your time doing this and be careful you don't cross the threads. Now once the action is hand tight, you need to lock it back into a vise again, and using either a piece of hardwood timber like I have or a large spanner placed into the trigger housing slot, tighten the action that last little bit with a few taps. Now what you're looking for here is that the scope grooves all perfectly line up. This will ensure you haven't either over tightened it or under tightened it. Next step is to fit the large bolt that holds the anti-bear trap device in place. Don't forget to replace the washer that came off with it. Now I found the easiest way to do this was to take up some of the spring tension in the anti-bear trap device, using a parallel punch to push it up towards the back of the rifle. This gave me enough freedom to screw the bolt into place and tighten it with a 13mm spanner. But be careful not to nip the anti-bear trap device, as it has to move freely either side of the large bolt. Now the fiddly bit, the trigger unit. I did find if you pushed the large lever in the top of the unit in to the action cocked, it did make things easier. Place the trigger unit back into the slot in the trigger block. Then, ensuring that the spring is still fitted to the end of the safety catch, push it into the safety catch hole and hold it flush there. Now, to line up the holes in the trigger unit and the trigger block, I used 2 parallel punches. Of course, this is the fiddly bit. Now, start to push one of the trigger retaining pins in from the opposite side. It should push the parallel punch out as it goes, keeping everything in alignment, though you may have to give it a wee bit of a wiggle. Then push the second one in. This one wasn't so cooperative and I had to give it a little tap with a hammer, but I got there in the end. Remember, these 2 pins are a different length, and the shorter of the 2 pins goes to the back of the rifle. Once in place, hammer them in evenly using the parallel punch and the hammer. One thing that I did notice is that the retaining pins did seem to start easier at one end than they did the other, so they might have a slight taper in them, so watch out for this. Once done, trip the trigger to reset the trigger unit before you try to cock the rifle. Next step is to refit the rifle stock. Now I like to give the action a good wipe down before I fit the stock to make sure I get all those grubby fingerprints off. Otherwise the rifle could be rusting in onto the stock and you'd never know it. Then drop the trigger guard into place and start the large stock screw at the front of the trigger guard. Now I'm deliberately leaving these screws loose as I don't want to tighten anything down until I get all the screws properly started into their place. You'll probably notice in the little plastic tray that there's two of the metal compression washers left over, as the instructions really only recommend using two for the 12 foot-pound limit. There's also the little black nylon spacer, which is designed to locate over the guide tube to add additional pre-compression if required to increase performance, but it's recommended not to use this until after the rifle is chronographed, and only then if need be. When you're fitting the fore-end screws, remember to put the two little washers onto them before you tighten them into place. Now I have all the screws into place, I can start tightening them up properly. Be careful not to over tighten the little screw at the back of the trigger guard, as these were always very easy to wring the threads on the older Weihrauchs. Again, I like to give the top of the action a bit of a wipe down before refitting the scope and the mount, just in case there's any grubby fingerprints that might start rusting below the mount afterwards. I give each of the mounting bolts a little snug up, just enough to hold the mount into place. Then give each one of them one last torque up. It's a good solid one-piece sports match mount with a retaining pin that fits into the top of the rifle's action, so it shouldn't be going anywhere. Time to fire a few shots over the chronograph and see whether all that effort has made any difference. Now I've been shooting the rifle on and off for about a month now, so the action should have well settled in after fitting the V-Mach kit into it. And already I can see there's a good bit more performance out of the rifle. I'm quite chuffed with that actually. So, with a high of 735 feet per second and a low of 729 feet per second, we've a spread over 5 shots of 6 feet per second. That's pretty good. And I'm using a 10.5 grain 177 Bisley Magnum pellet, which is producing about 12.4 foot-pounds of energy. Now, if this was in the UK mainland, you'd probably have to take one of them compression washers out to make sure you're inside the 12 foot-pound legal limit. But since I'm in Northern Ireland and already have the air rifle on a firearm certificate, I'm just going to leave it where it is. So, while you watch me do a wee bit of target shooting in the background, I'll go over my final thoughts on the V-Mach Tuning Kit for the HW97. Now, I realise my rifle did have a broken spring, but going back to when the rifle was new, it did shoot quite smoothly right out of the box. But after fitting the tuning kit, I do think it is marginally smoother on cocking and firing cycle. Now you do need a little more effort to cock the rifle than before. It's not much, but it is noticeable, and the recoil on the rifle on firing feels a little more snappier, or a better word might be quicker, so there might be a slightly quicker lock time with it. One thing that I have noticed is that there is less twisting sensation or torque given off during the firing cycle, as the mainspring uncurls as it travels forward with the piston. Now this must be due to the little synthetic spring guide mounted in the end of the mainspring, or top hat as some people call it, allowing the mainspring to spin inside the piston freely. Whatever it is, it does allow you to hold the rifle on aim much easier during the firing cycle, or follow through as its proper name goes. One thing I'm not sure about is whether or not the rifle actually sounds any quieter now it has the tuning kit fitted. I can't really tell. You listen to the footage yourself and give me an idea of your thoughts in the comments. One thing I would like to see is some form of black and white photographs to go with the step-by-step instructions, or even an exploded diagram showing you the rifle and its various parts and their proper names. I think that would be very useful for anybody who wasn't quite sure what they were doing. Before I started stripping the rifle down, I done a wee bit of research online and even looked up a lot of other people's videos on YouTube on how to strip and tune the HW97 before I started, which gave me a good bit of confidence in what I was doing. But all in all, I'm quite chuffed, especially since I saw how much more powerful and consistent the rifle was shooting after fitting the tuning kit to it. I know there's cheaper tuning kits out there, but for the money I'm quite happy I've spent it, and the rifle's up and running better than it ever was before.